Well, firstly, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure, a great honor to be here. This is my first ever trip to Denver, and so it's a real privilege to spend it in your company. Now, I'm going to talk today about my book, How We Fight, and I hope we can have some interesting discussion afterwards, because it's certainly a provocative and timely debate. So let's start off by realizing that at first glance, America's wars, they seem unique. The Civil War, stockades and bayonets, World War I, machine guns, World War II, D-Day, or today's conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. But while America's wars don't repeat themselves, they do rhyme. There are profound patterns in how we think about war, how we experience war, and how we fight war. And so in the book, I try to tease out what these patterns are and show that they have tremendous consequences. For 2 centuries, we have loved overthrowing tyrants, and for 2 centuries, we have hated dealing with the messy consequences. And this insight explains why people support some wars but not others, how the United States fights, why Washington wins and sometimes loses, and how we remember and learn from war. But these attitudes can be very dangerous. In Afghanistan and Iraq, we marched in and we overthrew tyrants, and then we looked to leave as quickly as possible. We won the war, and then we lost the peace, with thousands of Americans dead and hundreds of billions of dollars expended. So, let's start off with a big question. Do Americans love war? Well, the traditional answer, of course, is no. Americans are reluctant warriors. There is a very profound anti-war tradition in the United States. Think about Hemingway's literature. Think about James Madison saying back in 1795, quote, "Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded." And yet others suggest that Americans do love war. Andrew Bacevich, for example, has argued that we have a penchant for permanent war. The US defense budget almost matches the defense spending of all other countries in the world put together. Yet neither of these 2 views is completely right. The truth is that we do love war, but only a certain kind of war. And to understand what this kind is, imagine yourself sitting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and looking straight ahead toward the Capitol building. Behind you is a marble Abraham Lincoln, architect of the crusade to free the slaves and save the Union. Straight ahead lie the 56 pillars and the giant arches of the World War II Memorial, signifying America's common purpose when the greatest generation united to crush evil. Anchoring the military vista at the far end of the mall is a statue of Ulysses S. Grant, sitting calmly atop his horse as the fury of battle plays out beneath him. Straight ahead of us is a triumphant tale, with World War II bookended by the Civil War titans, Lincoln and Grant. This is the type of war we love, where we fight for decisive victory, regime change, and the noblest of ideals. In short, a magnificent crusade. But if we broaden our view from the Lincoln Memorial, our peripheral vision reveals a far less comfortable military narrative. For over on the left on the mall, you have the Vietnam War Memorial. And this is a dark vision of warfare. A sunken black wall memorializes the campaign in South Vietnam from 1965 to 1973. Now, Vietnam was not a magnificent crusade. Instead, it was a nation-building mission where we stabilize foreign lands, oversee elections, or fight insurgents. We don't love nation-building at all. Instead, we usually see it as a failed quagmire, whether it's in Vietnam or Somalia or today in Afghanistan or Iraq. So, the mall is like a mirror on the soul of the United States. It reveals our experience of war. And I argue in the book that if you want to understand how Americans think about war and fight war, you need to distinguish between two types of military conflict. The first is war against foreign countries. For example, World War II or the First Gulf War. This is the kind of war that we love. The second kind of military campaign is nation building, where we don't fight against another country, instead we fight against insurgents. For example, in Vietnam, Somalia, or Afghanistan, this is the kind of war that we hate. So, let's first consider how we think about wars against foreign countries, like, for example, the World Wars, which I call the Crusade tradition. The way we think about these wars is captured in a song, and that song is the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The song is now approaching its 150th anniversary. It's a hallowed treasure, a second national anthem. In 1861, in the early months of the Civil War, Julia Ward Howe was lying there in bed in the early light of morning when these lines of poetry appeared in her mind. She leapt out of bed and, as she later recalled, scribbled down the lines with an old stump of a pen and then fell back asleep feeling that something of importance had happened to her. The Atlantic Monthly paid Howe $5 to publish the poem and gave it a title, The Battle Hymn of the Republic. This song captures how we think about military campaigns against foreign countries as righteous quests to smite tyrants and spread freedom. These wars should only be fought for majestic goals, unconditional surrender, overthrowing the enemy regime, creating a new democratic government, and transforming the world. Any lesser goal is unworthy. As the battle hymn says, "He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat." The pattern is striking. The American public supported the goal of regime change, in other words, total victory as the goal, in every single war against a foreign country since the Civil War. You may be thinking, don't all countries fight wars this way? Don't you want to win a total victory? Well, actually, no. When most countries fight wars, they strive for restricted or limited goals, say capture a province here or a city there, and then negotiate with the adversary. But this is not how we like to fight wars. We believe that war should always end with a surrender ceremony in Tokyo Harbor. So why are we a crusader nation? Well, there are two powerful forces in American culture which drive this crusading impulse: idealism and vengeance. First of all, America is an incredibly idealistic society. Partly this is because of America's exceptional religiosity. As the battle hymn goes, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And we're also committed to political idealism, with a profound faith in democracy and self-determination and free enterprise, and so on. Almost every American signs up to this ideology, this creed. Julia Ward Howe wrote, "As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free." So once we start fighting against another country, American idealism tends to encourage a missionary impulse to spread our values through total victory, whether it's, say, emancipation in the Civil War, or saving the world for democracy in World War I, or the four freedoms in World War II, or liberating Iraq more recently. In fact, if you take out a $1 bill, you can see this ethos. You've probably looked at a dollar bill, how many times? Tens of thousands of times. But how closely have you ever looked at it? Because on the reverse of the dollar bill, there is the Great Seal of the United States. And underneath the seal it says, Novus Ordo Seclorum, which means a new order of the ages. It is a reference to the beginning of the American era and a worldwide revolution against tyrants and despots. So we have this missionary impulse to spread our ideals. But the second reason that we crusade in wars against foreign countries is retribution. The American crusader sows the seeds of liberty with one hand and wields an avenging sword with the other. We also fight zealously to punish those who have violated our core values. Vengeance was an incredibly powerful motivator to fight for total victory against the Confederacy in the Civil War, the Japanese in World War II, and the Taliban and Saddam Hussein after 9/11. As Julia Ward Howe wrote, "Let the hero born of woman crush the serpent with his heel." So inspired by idealism and vengeance, we see wars against foreign countries as crusades. What about this other use of force, nation building? This refers to military interventions within another country, designed to create a stable and democratic government or defeat insurgents. For example, Vietnam or Somalia, or today in Afghanistan and Iraq. War against a foreign country is about destroying an enemy state. Nation building is about constructing a friendly state. So how do we experience nation building missions? Well, we don't see them as crusades, that's for sure. Common metaphors for nation building include sand trap, swamp, quicksand, morass, sinkhole, and bottomless pit. These images all suggest a messy operation where the objectives are vague, withdrawal is difficult, and each stride forward only gets the United States further entrenched. But the most popular image for nation building is quagmire, meaning an area of boggy ground whose surface yields under the tread. Back in 1900, Mark Twain described the US nation-building mission in the Philippines as, quote, a quagmire, from which each fresh step renders the difficulty of extrication immensely greater. Fast forward a century, and New York Times columnist Bob Herbert in 2009 talked about the Afghan quagmire, depicting a war that long ago turned into a quagmire. So I call the American response to nation building the quagmire tradition. Put simply, we just don't like nation building. Opinion polls consistently show that we're much happier battling against an enemy country than fighting insurgents or trying to build democracy in another country. The American military is also traditionally very skeptical about nation building. And crucially, when we do start nation building in another country, we almost always see the outcome as a failure. Over time, these perceptions of failure erode support for a mission, encourage withdrawal, and make us wary about future interventions. When we nation build, we certainly don't sing the battle hymn of the Republic. We're much more likely to sing Country Joe McDonald's 1965, I Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die rag. And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Now you may be thinking again, doesn't everybody hate nation building? Well, interestingly, the Europeans, Japanese, Australians, and Canadians are far more at ease with nation building than Americans are. These countries have come to see their military not as warriors in the American sense, but more as well-armed police with a primary duty of peacekeeping and humanitarian types of operations. You know, back in 1995, Canadians were asked for their country's greatest contribution to the world. What is your country's greatest contribution to the world? The top choice, surprisingly enough, was not hockey. It was peacekeeping. How many Americans would say peacekeeping is America's greatest gift to the world? Not many. So why do we hate nation building so much? Well, there's a really obvious explanation. These interventions are depressing because they actually do always fail. And of course, there have been several very real debacles. Vietnam, to a lesser extent, Iraq. But Washington doesn't always fail. America's first nation-building mission, Southern Reconstruction, after the Civil War, transformed the lives of black citizens. In post-World War II, Germany, Japan, Italy, Austria, and South Korea were all notable successes. The intervention in Somalia in the early 1990s actually saved thousands of lives. Peacekeeping operations in Bosnia and Kosovo recently have also helped to stabilize war-torn provinces. So we don't always fail. Interestingly, the same cultural forces that make us see wars against foreign countries as these grand crusades also make us see nation building and counterinsurgency as a disastrous quagmire. For instance, when we start fighting against insurgents, revenge no longer motivates us. The war starts looking morally confusing. We're no longer sure who the good guys and the bad guys are. Nobody wants to fight in Afghanistan today simply to punish the Taliban. And our idealism, which remember inspires us to see wars against foreign countries as these great quests, actually makes us disillusioned with nation building. Why is this? Well, nation building is about constructing democracy and stability. So our idealism encourages us to set an incredibly high bar for success. Before we're sure we've won in a nation building mission, we want the target country to live up to our sacred principles of freedom and good government. In other words, we want the target country to look as stable and free as the United States. But impoverished societies like Somalia or Afghanistan, racked by war and ethnic division, have absolutely no chance of living up to our ideals or looking like the United States anytime soon. And so, when we intervene in a country like Afghanistan, it is virtually certain we will see that mission as a disastrous quagmire, regardless of whatever happens on the ground. Furthermore, American presidents often unwittingly encourage these harsh judgments of their own nation-building missions with flowery and idealistic language and promises of building a beacon of freedom in the Middle East and mission accomplished and so on. But that's not all. Interestingly, both the left and the right in America hate nation building. Left-wing critics see nation building as imperialism. The United States, after all, was born in a revolt against the British Empire. Here we are supposedly following in their footsteps in Iraq and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, conservatives don't like nation building either. They often see nation building as a kind of big government social engineering project. Our fearsome warriors spend their time giving handouts to foreigners. Noam Chomsky called the US nation-building mission in Kosovo, he called it imperialism. Donald Rumsfeld called the same mission welfarism. The only thing Chomsky and Rumsfeld agree on is they don't like nation-building. So in the American mind, nation-building and interstate war or war against foreign countries are polar opposite experiences, like yin and yang. War against insurgents is hell. Campaigns against other countries are a hell of a war. Back in 2000, George W. Bush said, quote, "I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation-building. I think our troops ought to be used to help overthrow the dictator when it's in our best interests." That sentiment is as American as apple pie. Consider some of the striking differences in how we think about these two different types of war. Interstate wars are good wars. Nation-building missions are bad wars. Interstate wars unify the public. Nation-building divides American opinion. Interstate wars are usually seen as victories. Nation-building is usually seen as a defeat. Interstate war has unearthed a legion of heroes, like Grant, Jackson, Pershing, MacArthur, Patton, Schwarzkopf. Nation-building generates almost no heroes. The exact same event looks completely different if it happens when we're battling another country or if it happens when we're fighting insurgents. For example, in interstate war, if the enemy kills civilians, like say the Nazis did in World War II, then it just proves how righteous our cause really is. But in a nation-building mission, if insurgents commit atrocities, like say in Iraq, it doesn't show how righteous we are. Instead, Washington is blamed and it signals that we're losing. Or if in interstate war, let's say American soldiers kill civilians, like say Japanese civilians in World War II, nobody really cares. It's collateral damage. But in a nation-building mission, the same event is a war crime, testifying to the immorality of the conflict. Yet even though our experience of these two kinds of war is so different, interestingly, the two traditions, the Crusade tradition, the quagmire tradition, they reinforce each other because our zeal for regime change leads us directly into nation building. Under the so-called Pottery Barn rule, you break it, you own it, The United States has little choice but to try to stabilize the lands it has conquered, whether it be, say, the Confederacy, after the Civil War, or more recently Afghanistan and Iraq. So this helps to explain why Americans keep engaging in an activity they so deeply dislike. But of course, our support for regime change, our distaste for stability operations, this is a combination of attitudes uniquely designed to breed frustration. We like breaking it, we don't like owning it. Now, let me just very quickly show you how these traditions can explain American history. And in the book, I have a couple hundred pages on this. I'll reduce it to just a few minutes, but you'll get a sense of the rhythm of American history using these traditions. If America's military experience is an epic song, each verse has a predictable rhythm. When the first shot is fired, the public rallies around the flag and the president. Crusading enthusiasm sweeps the nation until the great dictator is overthrown. But once the United States begins nation building in conquered land, hope soon turns to regret. The Crusade tradition was born amidst the bayonets and stockades of the Civil War, America's first crusade. Although Northerners would have balked at the label, the Civil War was a de facto interstate war. In other words, we were effectively fighting against another country, or the North was effectively fighting against another country. One that created its own constitution, raised armies, and was underpinned by a sense of nationalism. What was the object of the Northern war effort in the Civil War? Well, initially Lincoln outlined quite limited goals. He wanted to restore federal authority while avoiding what he called a remorseless revolutionary struggle. But as the fighting progressed in the Civil War, a great crusading wave rose up, and Northern opinion shifted in favor of a zealous campaign to refashion the Confederacy by emancipating the slaves. Victory in the Civil War prompted America's very first nation-building mission, Southern Reconstruction. Congress placed the Southern states under military rule, and federal troops acted a lot like modern-day peacekeepers, doing things like maintaining order, setting up governments, monitoring elections, and so on. Reconstruction was soon viewed in the North as a disastrous quagmire with no end in sight. Perceptions of failure led directly to the end of nation building and a withdrawal of federal troops. In its arc of hope and disillusionment, the mission established a template for future nation-building operations through Iraq and beyond. But then quagmire was followed by crusade, when the United States locked horns with Spain in 1898. And just like in the Civil War, a crusading spirit overtook the nation. The battle hymn of the Republic even gained new lyrics. Let us furl again old glory in the name of liberty. And just like in the Civil War, US objectives became more majestic over time. A war that began with the limited goal of freeing Cuba from Spanish rule ended with the United States annexing Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The United States went to sleep a republic, and it woke up an empire. But the victory over Spain landed the United States in another nation-building mission, a counterinsurgency war against Filipino nationalists. And just like with Southern Reconstruction, Americans increasingly saw nation-building in the Philippines as a quagmire and quickly grew tired of imperialism. The US then launched its third crusade in World War I. Again, before we entered the war, Woodrow Wilson called for a peace without victory, which left no side humiliated. But as soon as we started fighting in World War I, the campaign evolved into this grand democratic crusade against autocracy and a quest to end all war. The battle hymn again reverberated around the nation with new lyrics. Quote, "We have heard the cry of anguish from the victims of the Hun." You know, in World War I, 2 million Americans traveled to France to fight. Of those 2 million, there is just one veteran still alive, Frank Buckles. The ties binding us to World War I are down to a single fragile strand. The Great Crusade of World War I was not the only military campaign in this era. Disillusionment with the mission in the Philippines had put paid to imperialism, but the United States didn't give up on nation building entirely. For those of you who know your history, in the early part of the 20th century, the US engaged in several dozen nation-building missions in the Caribbean, known as the Banana Wars. And like Southern Reconstruction and the intervention in the Philippines, these missions were all seen as failures and futile quagmires. When FDR became president in the 1930s, he announced a new policy called the Good Neighbor Policy, which put an end to these nation-building missions. World War II has gone down in history as our perfect crusade. And despite hundreds of thousands of deaths and injuries in World War II, public support for the war effort barely wavered. And again, we fought for majestic goals, unconditional surrender, democratization of Germany and Japan, the creation of a new international organization, the United Nations, to end war for all time. I'll tell you a little story that links in with this. And it's the story of Patrick Hitler. Now, you probably know Adolf Hitler. Many of you are not familiar with Patrick Hitler, Adolf Hitler's nephew. Patrick was British, born in Britain. And in the 1930s, he actually worked in Germany for a while. He had connections, principally his uncle, who was running Germany. But he left Germany in 1939 and came to the United States, where he lectured on the subject, quote, "Why I Hate My Uncle." After Pearl Harbor, Patrick Hitler tried to enlist in the US military, but was denied because his name was Hitler and his uncle was the Führer of Germany. But he wrote a letter to FDR asking to join the war effort, and FDR personally intervened to let him fight. Patrick survived the war, and after the war he came back to the United States, changed his name. It was a bad time to be called Hitler. Changed his name, married an American woman, and he had 3 children. Now, it's important to note that Patrick Hitler was the only living descendant of Adolf Hitler. And his 3 children reportedly swore a sacred pact that none of them would ever marry or have children of their own, so that the Hitler bloodline would finally end. The only descendants of Hitler still live in New Jersey. Now, if anything symbolizes the Great Crusade of World War II, it is that Hitler's own nephew signed up for this quest for freedom. But of course, the perfect crusade was then followed by the perfect quagmire, Vietnam. Quagmire was then again followed by crusade, with the first Gulf War in 1991. This was a remarkably one-sided affair. There were only 150 deaths, US deaths, in the first Gulf War. To put that in perspective, around 1,200 US personnel became pregnant during the campaign. So for every American who died, there were 8 military personnel who were expecting children. And as soon as we started fighting in the first Gulf War, there was the same pattern emerged, a dramatic shift in American opinion in favor of an all-out crusade against the enemy. Whitney Houston dedicated her first televised concert as a solo artist to the soldiers and their families. Among the songs was that old crusading classic, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Americans, as usual, were uncomfortable with any kind of limited goals which would leave Saddam Hussein still in power. Crusading sentiment swelled up, and the number of Americans favoring a march on Baghdad to overthrow Saddam rose to well over 70%. Interestingly, most of these hawks were willing to sacrifice thousands of American lives to get rid of Saddam Hussein. George H.W. Bush, the president, was in a lose-lose situation. He was effectively damned if he marched on Baghdad and damned if he didn't march on Baghdad. When he resisted regime change as a goal, Americans were left frustrated with the end result of the war. Most Americans said the outcome of the first Gulf War was not a victory because Saddam Hussein was still in power. But what if Bush had marched on Baghdad? What if he had overthrown Saddam Hussein? Well, he would have landed the United States in an unpopular nation-building mission in Iraq. Just ask his son. Remember, we demand regime change. We hate dealing with the consequences of regime change. Then in the 1990s, the United States launched its 5th wave of nation-building missions in Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, and Kosovo. All of these missions were unpopular with the American public. All of them were seen as failures. All of them caused bruising political battles with Congress. But they weren't quagmires. Indeed, these missions were more successful than many people realize. Take the example of Somalia, which has gone down in history as an utter catastrophe. In the fall of 1992, George H.W. Bush decided to launch a humanitarian operation in Somalia. And in December of 1992, an advance guard of US Special Forces landed on one of the beaches in Somalia. But there was an army waiting for them. An army that used bright lights that blinded the commandos. Fortunately, it was an army of cameramen and journalists who had been tipped off by the Department of Defense as a kind of PR exercise to boost support for the intervention. It was a cross between Oscar Night and D-Day. Now, the mission in Somalia proved in many ways to be very successful. The best estimates are that the mission saved something like 100,000 Somali lives. But the American public switched their attention off and were awakened in October 1993 with news, of course, of the Black Hawk Down battle in which 18 Americans had been killed, and the overall intervention went down in history as a catastrophic failure, which I think is not the full story. Or consider US intervention in Kosovo in 1999. Again, it wasn't very popular with Americans. Kosovo is probably the most pro-American country anywhere outside the United States. The Kosovo Albanians are immensely grateful for the American nation-building mission. If you want to go and visit Kosovo, you can drive down Bill Clinton Boulevard. I encourage you to visit the 11-foot-high statue of Bill Clinton in Pristina. You might, for example, stay at the Hotel Victory, which has a huge model of the Statue of Liberty on the roof. So not in every case does the population turn against Americans. Certainly that's not true in Kosovo. And then finally, more recently, this pattern of crusade and quagmire played out as part of the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. Americans were confident and supportive during the interstate war phase, when we were overthrowing the Taliban and marching on Baghdad to eliminate Saddam Hussein's government. At the memorial service for 9/11, the choir struck up a chorus that has seen Americans through many great trials, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But then suddenly, Americans found themselves in the midst of the greatest nation-building operation since Vietnam. Almost the moment US forces began fighting insurgents and overseeing elections, the entire tone of American thinking about these wars changed. And the mood soon grew profoundly gloomy. So, let's look ahead and also assess these two traditions. Well, seeing the patterns that underlie our thinking about war, seeing these patterns that bind together 2 centuries of warfare, enables us to make some predictions about how Americans would experience a war against Iran. Earlier this year, Sarah Palin generously gave some political advice to Obama. She said that he could improve his political standing by attacking Iran. But the argument in my book suggests that there would be very few long-term political benefits for Obama from attacking Iran. Instead, Americans would experience war with Iran in a series of predictable stages. In the first phase, before the war began, Americans would probably be very divided over the merits of fighting Iran. Americans were divided before many of their wars, before the Iraq War, before the Gulf War, even before the World Wars, even before the Civil War. The moment the first bomb was dropped, there would be a sea change in American attitudes. As Americans rallied around the president and the flag, got the yellow ribbons out, and a great crusading wave overtook the United States. At this point, Obama would face a critical decision. Does he go for regime change, or does he keep the war limited and just take out the nuclear sites? If Obama decided to keep the war limited, allow the Iranian regime to stay in power, but just obliterate the nuclear sites. This would be extremely controversial. A great many Americans would say, you cannot leave these tyrants in power. We need to march on Tehran. And Obama would be criticized vociferously for doing that. But if Obama decided to escalate the war and go for regime change, then of course, regime change would be followed by nation building. And if you love nation building in Iraq, you really will love it in Iran. So in other words, Obama would have a choice. He can follow the fate of Bush 1, criticized for not taking out the tyrant, or he can follow the fate of Bush 2, bogged down in an unpopular nation-building mission. So it's hard to see how a war against Iran would offer many political benefits. So let me just say a few words about these two traditions. Is the Crusade tradition wise? Well, in titanic struggles like the Civil War and World War II, the Crusade tradition helped drive Americans to fight for ultimate victory, to keep our eyes on the prize. And American idealism is, in many ways, one of the most attractive features of the United States. It's part of America's great moral courage. It means that we often fight for things that are profoundly good. But the Crusade tradition also has a dark side. By encouraging escalation in war, it's very difficult for any American president to fight a limited war against a foreign country involving restricted objectives or a fine-tuned application of firepower. In today's world of daisy-cutter bombs and weaponized anthrax, war has never been more complex, more unpredictable, more potentially destructive. The United States must be flexible about using force, sometimes aiming for limited objectives, other times for far-reaching goals. We can't always march on the enemy's capital. So what about the quagmire tradition? Is our aversion to nation-building healthy? Well, in some ways, yes. Our skepticism has sometimes deterred us from unwise interference in other countries' civil wars. But again, the quagmire tradition can be dangerous for US interests. This tendency to see stabilization missions as a debacle can become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, where disillusionment undermines our commitment to the mission, which then leads to very real failure. That was the story of Southern Reconstruction and arguably the story of later missions as well. And the quagmire tradition can skew our memory of the past so that we sometimes learn the wrong lessons. When the United States was wrongly seen as having failed disastrously in Somalia in 1993, Washington was reluctant to repeat this supposed error by intervening the following year in Rwanda, where close to 1 million people were slaughtered. All of this may leave the United States ill-equipped to deal with the future of war. We live in an era where the primary security challenges arise from failed states, rogue states, drug trafficking, terrorism. These challenges will undoubtedly lead the United States down the path of nation building. But we prefer smashing dictators, not dealing with the messy consequences. We prefer using force to destroy, not to build. And the Crusade and quagmire traditions are particularly dangerous in combination. The Bush administration was a pure exponent of the Crusade and quagmire traditions. Officials were determined to overthrow tyrants, defeat evil, and transform the world, but they were also allergic to the entire idea of nation building. When we invaded Afghanistan in 2001, Bush, of course, wanted to fight for regime change, determined to overthrow the Taliban. But the Bush administration had absolutely no interest in nation building in Afghanistan. In 2002, a year after the fall of the Taliban, there were only 10,000 American troops in the whole of Afghanistan. We had basically left. And we had left so that the Bush administration could launch another crusade, this time, of course, against Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, where the same story played out. determined to overthrow the tyrant, no interest whatsoever in nation building. In February 2003, just a few weeks before we invaded Iraq, Donald Rumsfeld gave a speech. The title of the speech was Beyond Nation Building, in which he contrasted the deep commitment in the Balkans with tens of thousands of US troops, a drawn-out nation-building mission, which he didn't like, with the model we would use in Iraq, a light footprint. We'd be in and out before anyone realized. Well, of course, the result of the light footprint was that Iraq descended into anarchy and chaos and civil war. And the Bush administration was so loathed to nation build or get involved in counterinsurgency that for years it denied that that's in fact what was happening in Iraq. In 2005, after 2 years of counterinsurgency, at a press conference, Donald Rumsfeld refused to use the word insurgent. Instead, he wanted to use the phrase enemies of the government. His colleague at the press conference was a US general who kept slipping up and using the word insurgent. And the general said, he kept apologizing to Rumsfeld and said, I'm sorry, I'm not trainable today. How could we win in Iraq if we wouldn't even recognize the struggle that we were engaged in? So we have, I suggest, two options. Either we don't invade in the first place, and some of you may think that that's what we should have done with Afghanistan and or Iraq. Or, secondly, if we do invade, then we need to have a plan to win the peace, and that means taking nation building seriously. But in recent wars, we have chosen the third and worst option. Invade, overthrow the regime, no plan to win the peace. Now, I can talk about this more, if you like, in Q&A. But in the book, I suggest that the solution to this is to look back through American history. I started this story with the Civil War. Look back before the Civil War to the time of the Founding Fathers and think about the founders' view of the military. Early Americans did not adopt the crusade and quagmire traditions. In fact, they held the opposite view of war. The founders explicitly resisted crusades. When they fought wars against other countries, they deliberately fought them as limited, restricted campaigns. For example, against Britain in 1812 or Mexico in the 1840s. And the founders also envisaged the US military as an army of nation builders, designed to construct roads and national infrastructure, explore and map the West, and aid stricken pioneers. West Point was set up by Thomas Jefferson in the very early 1800s. It became a great foundry of American nation building. The curriculum was focused on engineering and mathematics, not military studies. In fact, it provided the best engineering education in the United States. And its graduates spread out to mark their imprint on the young nation. In other words, in their very different era, the founders created a multi-purpose army designed for a wide range of challenges. And in our very different era, we also need a multi-purpose army with a skill set that extends far beyond overthrowing enemy tyrants. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your comments. A lot of people don't remember that World War II actually started in September of '39, and we didn't, enter it until, of course, December of '41. So over 2 years of being out of it, and that was driven, as I understand it, by a very strong isolationism attitude and political will within the country. And I wonder if you can ever imagine where isolationism comes back in U.S. foreign policy and U.S. public policy in a strong way.
Great, that's a terrific question and a really important question. What I would say is that yes and no. So the yes is that we tend to see these cycles in American history, cycles of what you might call interventionism and then cycles where the American public is more skeptical about intervention. I actually would link these cycles with our experience of nation-building missions. So in fact, what tends to happen is we do a bunch of nation-building missions and then get disillusioned with them and then turn inward and want to focus more on domestic affairs. So for example, after Vietnam, there was a skepticism about foreign intervention and Americans turned more inward. I think you're seeing something similar today. In fact, the Gallup pollster has asked a question to Americans for the last 50 years, which is, should the United States basically try to focus on its own problems and let other countries deal with their own issues? And you had a plurality of Americans, just under 50% last year, say we should focus on our own problems. That's the highest figure for that question, I think, ever. But what I would say is that these more recent examples of caution about foreign intervention, it's difficult to call them isolationism. You know, back in the 1930s, the US really was isolationist. We had laws that prevented any Americans from selling weapons to any country that was in a war. And what you might call isolationism today is a very different animal. And I think that the world has changed. The United States is more powerful. It has a network of global bases and commitments. And I think that that's always going to limit the extent to which the US will truly be isolationist. But it's a great question.
Next question is here.
I want to go to your historical comment that prior to the Civil War we did limited interventions and then we began doing these big crusades. Is that partly a function of the ability to do a crusade versus a limited intervention?
That's again a terrific question. There are a few reasons why we evolved from the founding fathers' sort of caution to this more crusading model, and the biggest reason is power. The founding fathers lived in a time when the United States was weak, and they believed that this experiment in liberty was incredibly fragile, that it could be crushed by the British or the French or the Spanish at any time. And this imbued them with caution. But during the 19th century, because of industrialization, immigration, the United States became more powerful. And essentially a force was injected into the petri dish of America's experiment in liberty, and that was power. Now, Americans had the capability to do what they wanted. They had the tools. Americans had to ask themselves, do we want to do what we can do? And this made America, I suggest, the crusader state it was born to be. Once America had the power, then it tended to see its idealism through to its ultimate conclusion. So I think you're absolutely right, that power is a critical part of the story.
Have you implied that the focus of the military academies has changed over time?
It certainly has. The West Point in its early days really was a school of engineering. Its top graduates would immediately go into the Army Corps of Engineers. And I'm not saying that we should copy that exactly today, but there are some interesting potential lessons. Since that time, the academies have transformed their curriculums, and in many ways, obviously, sensibly. What I would say is that in recent years, the academies have made some important steps forward in broadening their curriculum beyond just overthrowing another country, classic conventional war. For example, West Point now focuses a larger part of its curriculum on foreign cultures and learning foreign languages, which is critical if you're trying to stabilize a target country. What I would say is that I would encourage West Point and the other academies to push this further, because this broader skill set, I think, is absolutely essential given the challenges that we face today.
We have another question here. We're going to just holler because the microphone is interacting with the speaker.
Sure.
What do you think should have been done in Cuba?
Okay, well, that's a good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. Well, we have tried lots of things with Cuba. We have tried assassination. Back in the 1960s, the US policy was to assassinate Castro. We tried various different plots, exploding seashells. We had a cigar that would make Castro's beard fall out, because if he lost his beard, he would lose his magical powers. There is even a story that the CIA trained a woman to seduce Castro and then kill him. And she did seduce Castro, fell in love with him, and stayed on the island. So we have tried assassination. That didn't work. We have tried invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, well, an invasion by Cuban expatriates. That didn't work. We have tried an embargo, which also, I would say, has not really been very successful. I would encourage the United States to rethink its embargo policy. Clearly, it has not overthrown the regime. Castro survived a great many American presidents. And while you can argue about some restrictions on trade, I think if there were more Americans traveling in Cuba and more contacts, I think this might help actually promote change in Cuba. But there are no easy answers to that, but that's my 2 cents.
Another question in the very back, and then we're going to come up to the front.
You spoke of nation building
Mhm.
and failure of nation building in the United States throughout history. But if you look at Germany and Japan after World War II and then Kosovo, or more recently, which were fairly successful or more successful nation building, what commonalities or what lessons can we learn about that for the future?
Well, what I would say is America's actually much better at nation building than Americans think, right? So the general sentiment is that we just always fail, while the actual reality is that we sometimes fail and we sometimes have more success. And so Germany and Japan were successful, Kosovo was successful, Bosnia was successful, Southern Reconstruction was successful, at least as long as the will was there. And there are other cases as well. South Korea was a good example of successful nation building. The key lesson from the literature is that you need a commitment of time and resources. Staying long does not guarantee success. Leaving early guarantees failure. And so in Germany and Japan, we made a huge commitment of time and resources. In Kosovo and Bosnia, again, there were tens of thousands of US troops, as well as allied forces, and eventually a European Union commitment as well. And that was relatively successful. I think what we found in Afghanistan and Iraq is that you can't nation build on the cheap. You need to do it seriously. And I think if we'd gone into Iraq with, whatever you think of the merits of the invasion, if we'd gone into Iraq with a great many more troops, I think we might have seen fewer US casualties, not more. So there are a number of different factors. Of course, some environments are much more difficult than others. Vietnam, we were fighting an incredibly committed opponent. But the lesson does seem to be a commitment of time and resources is pretty essential.
Next question up front.
At what point would you consider the transition from the freedom-loving republic of the Founding Fathers to the imperialist empire that we have today?
Well, there was some loaded language in that question. So I'm going to delicately step around that by saying that there's a big debate about whether America is really an empire. And America is probably the first possible empire to have worried about whether it might be an empire or not. My own sense, again, is that there's debate, and reasonable people can disagree, but my own sense is that America is not really an empire. Neil Ferguson, many of the great scholars disagree vociferously, but America is not really an empire because its behavior and so on is far removed from what you might consider the classic empires, especially the colonial empires. America had a brief period when it was an empire, when it was running the Philippines. and then it really was an empire. The Philippines were a colony. But it's important to distinguish being a superpower, a hyperpower, or a hegemon with global influence from empire. Because if we broaden this concept of empire so that any superpower, hyperpower, any highly influential state satisfies the criteria, then I think we're losing some conceptual clarity. So I would prefer to keep empire more of a sort of narrower, traditional understanding, essentially running colonies, and then use another phrase to describe the United States. That doesn't mean what the United States is doing is good. It doesn't defend it, but I'm cautious about this language of empire. It's also extremely loaded language, and that is also carries some risks.
If we look at the present and the future, the United States has really changed since the 1950s and 1960s. Most of the times we paid for our wars. We haven't paid for Afghanistan and Iraq. And I don't see the United States anywhere near the nation it was or it will be. So in my mind, the future does not hold either nation building or major wars for the United States.
Is there a question? Is there a question?
I mean, what do you think of that?
Can you just repeat the future? What did you say about the future? The future does not. You're cautious about the future.
Well, I mean, we're not paying for the war
Yep.
presently. We don't have the resources we had in the 50s and 60s. I don't see realistically the United States, except from habit, being either a nation building or a country that is going to be able to sustain any type of real war. And I was in the military.
Do you agree?
Well, again, you could look at that from a few different perspectives. One perspective would say that we're paying the military budget is a much smaller share of GDP than it was back in the 1950s and 60s. So that's the neoconservative argument that says that we can keep doing this indefinitely. But actually, I'm more cautious. And I think this is part of the much bigger issue, which is the United States needs to come up with a long-term plan to get its financial house in order. And there's this argument at the moment about cutting discretionary spending, which is only 10 or 15% of the total budget. This is not going to deal with the real issue, which is the defense budget, Social Security, and Medicare. So that is a massive challenge facing the United States. And the United States needs to get its financial house in order at a time when two critical things are happening. The first is we face security challenges from rogue states, failed states, and so on, that is very likely to lead the United States into nation-building types of missions. Maybe not on the same scale as Afghanistan and Iraq, but nation-building is going to happen. And we need to be prepared for that and have the resources for that. And then the second key development in the 21st century is the rise of China and India. Within 50 years, I believe that we will be in a tripolar world with three great powers: the United States, China, and India. And the key dynamic of the 21st century is going to be the relationship between these three countries. And so the United States needs to get its house in order so it can deal with the security challenges, the failed states and so on, and then also so it can deal effectively with great power relations and great power stability. So I share your concerns about that.
I think we have time for just two more
Questions?
I just wanted to know what is going on in Egypt.
With what has just happened in Egypt, is there a third way, another way we could do it besides we could, it seems like we're going to get involved in some way. Is there a different way that we could do it?
Well, of course, the last option really is U.S. military intervention. This should be the last option, And the great hope is that it is homegrown movements that can create democracy and stability. Saves us money. Fewer American troops are there. It's more legitimate. Nation building is the last resort. And what is happening in Egypt, or at least a positive interpretation, this is the path that we'd much rather see happen. This is how we'd like to see democracy spread. that's if the best case scenarios hold out. But of course, there are situations where we do need to nation build in extreme situations, and we should do it effectively. So I'm hopeful about Egypt, cautiously hopeful. The single most defining characteristic of what happened in Egypt, or the most encouraging characteristic, is that it was a peaceful revolution. That's the remarkable thing. There was some violence when the pro-government mobs were mobilized and attacked the demonstrators who fought back. But in the main, the demonstrators were remarkably well behaved and used tactics of non-violent resistance, which gave them huge moral legitimacy. And they seem to have learned from other cases where non-violent resistance was effective. For example, in overthrowing Milosevic in Serbia, there are Egyptians who said that they explicitly learned lessons from the Serbian model. And of course, non-violent resistance has also been effective, say, in the civil rights movement in the United States and in other cases as well. So that is one of the more encouraging aspects of the Egyptian situation. The less encouraging aspects would be that Egypt is still extremely volatile. There's a youth bulge in Egypt where there's a huge population of young people who don't have big economic opportunities. And those economic problems are not going to disappear overnight. And so I'm cautiously optimistic, but I wouldn't expect Egypt to just be like Eastern Europe, very quickly democratizing and becoming stable. I think we're going to have good days and bad days.
Last question. Oops, excuse me.
Two separate but related questions from a slightly different perspective. Your choice of Crusades does have a religious connotation, and I'm curious with respect to whether you see religion being implicit or explicit anymore. And the second question is your views of the controversial class of civilizations put forth by Huntington.
Okay, I have a 4-hour seminar with my class on the clash of civilizations. Religion is a very important part of the American experience of war. America is a highly religious society. It's one of the ways in which America is exceptional, much more religious than other typical rich democratic countries. And religion has played a very important role. Back in the Civil War, for example, religion helped motivate Northern soldiers to fight because the Northern interpretation of the Civil War was that it was a highly religious struggle, basically Satan against Christ. Now, the Southerners saw the war in precisely the same way, but with the roles reversed. In fact, in 1864, the North was very worried that they were being out-Christianized because the US Constitution does not explicitly mention God, but the Confederate Constitution did explicitly mention God. They were so worried they were being out-Christianized that in 1864, the North made a decision to stamp on its coins a phrase, "In God we trust." So religion has been very profound, and if you move forward to, say, even the Iraq War, you find, for example, the strongest supporters of the invasion of Iraq were evangelical Christians. And George W. Bush seems to have been part of his thinking about the war on terror as well. So I do think religion is a key part of the story. I think it's one strand of this great idealism that is the burning passion of America that drives America to do such wonderful things, but can also sometimes lead to zeal in wartime that can be dangerous. Clash of Civilizations, big topic. I would say I'm something of a skeptic, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.